A frail orphan girl walks into a bustling hospital and whispers just 2 words to a weary doctor. "I'm positive." What happens next? Chaos erupts. The alarms sound, the hospital locks down, and panic spreads like wildfire. But this isn't just a medical emergency. It's personal. Hidden in her tattered satchel is a diary that could unravel a mystery tied to a deadly epidemic. As the staff scrambles to uncover the truth, the doctor's connection to this child deepens. Who is this girl? What does she know? And what secret could be so powerful it forces a doctor to risk everything? The answer might change lives forever. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The winter wind whipped through the city streets, cutting through Clara's thin jacket like icy fingers. Her small boots, worn and a size too big, made soft shuffling sounds as she moved through the crowded sidewalks. At just 5 years old, Clara had learned to make herself invisible among the forest of adult legs rushing past her. She hugged her stuffed rabbit closer to her chest, the last gift from her mother. Its once soft fur was now matted and gray, but Clara couldn't imagine letting go of it. The memory of her mother's warm smile flashed through her mind, along with the gentle way she used to tuck Clara into bed each night. "Remember, sweetheart," her mother's voice echoed in her thoughts. "If you ever need help, hospitals are safe places. The doctors and nurses there help people. That's their job." Clara's stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since yesterday's half-eaten sandwich she'd found outside a deli. She'd gotten good at finding food, checking behind restaurants at closing time, or sometimes kind shop owners would give her their day-old bread. But today she was too tired to search. As the sky darkened and the street lights flickered on, Clara noticed more and more people staring at her. A woman in a business suit almost stopped to ask if she was lost, but Clara quickly ducked into a narrow alley. She'd learned that grown-ups asking questions usually meant trouble. Through the gaps between buildings, she caught sight of something bright. The emergency room sign of City General Hospital glowed like a beacon in the growing darkness. Clara remembered how her mother had taken her there once when she had a really bad cough. The nurses had given her cherry-flavored medicine and a colorful sticker. That was before her mother got sick, before the coughing that wouldn't stop, before Clara found herself alone. Taking a deep breath, Clara emerged from the alley and made her way toward the hospital entrance. The automatic doors whooshed open, bringing a rush of warm air that made her realize just how cold she'd been. The lobby was busy with people rushing back and forth, nurses in colorful scrubs, worried-looking families, doctors in long white coats. Clara pressed herself against a wall, clutching her rabbit tighter. The noise and movement overwhelmed her senses after so many quiet days on the streets. A television mounted on the wall showed cartoon characters, and nearby, a little boy played with toys while his mother filled out papers. She watched as people approached the big desk where ladies in blue shirts sat typing on computers. Everyone seemed to know exactly where to go and what to do. Clara didn't. Her legs felt wobbly, and the bright lights made her head hurt. That's when she saw him, a tall doctor with kind eyes and gray hair at his temples. He was talking softly to an elderly patient in a wheelchair, his gentle smile reminding Clara of the way her mother used to look at her. The name tag on his white coat read Dr. Asher. Clara's heart beat faster as she watched him. There was something about his calm presence that made the chaos around her seem less scary. As if sensing her gaze, Dr. Asher looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the busy lobby. Dr. Asher rubbed his tired eyes as he made his final rounds through the emergency room. 15 hours into his shift, the weight of caring for countless patients pressed heavily on his shoulders. Still, he maintained his gentle demeanor, a trait that had earned him the respect of both his colleagues and patients over his 25 years at City General. His thoughts drifted to his wife Grace and their daughter Lily, waiting at home with dinner probably long cold in the fridge. He'd missed family dinner again, something that happened more often than he liked to admit. The photo in his wallet of the 3 of them at the beach last summer reminded him of simpler times, before the hospital had become chronically understaffed. As he checked the chart of an elderly patient with pneumonia, he felt a slight tug on his white coat. Looking down, he found himself staring into the large, serious eyes of a tiny girl clutching a worn, stuffed rabbit. Her clothes were dirty, her dark hair tangled, and her cheeks hollow with hunger. Before he could speak, the little girl leaned close and whispered 2 words that made his blood run cold. "I'm positive." Dr. Asher's mind raced back to 5 years ago, the epidemic that had claimed hundreds of lives, including 3 of his fellow doctors. The particular strain had been especially deadly in children, with symptoms that didn't show until it was almost too late. The hospital had nearly collapsed under the strain of that crisis. "Sweetheart," he said, kneeling down to her level, keeping his voice calm despite the alarm bells ringing in his head. "Can you tell me your name?" "Clara," she whispered, hugging her rabbit tighter. Dr. Asher's training kicked in. He reached for the emergency protocol button on the wall while calling out to the nearest nurse. "Nancy, initiate Protocol 7 immediately. This is not a drill." The nurse's eyes widened in recognition and she sprinted to the main desk. Within seconds, the hospital's intercom system crackled to life. "Attention all staff. Protocol 7 is now in effect. This is not a drill. Repeat, Protocol 7 is now in effect." The emergency room erupted into controlled chaos. Security guards moved to seal the entrance doors. Nurses efficiently began distributing masks and gloves to everyone in the vicinity. Medical staff hurried to move current patients into isolation areas. Dr. Asher gently picked up Clara, who didn't resist but held onto her rabbit with both hands. "It's going to be okay," he assured her, carrying her toward the isolation ward. "We're going to take good care of you." Through the growing commotion, he could hear the heavy magnetic locks engaging throughout the building. The hospital's ventilation system switched to containment mode with a low hum. Staff members who had lived through the previous epidemic moved with practiced precision, their faces grave but determined. As Dr. Asher carried Clara down the rapidly clearing hallway, he noticed how light she felt in his arms, how her small frame trembled slightly. Despite his exhaustion and the gravity of the situation, his heart ached for this tiny, brave child who had walked into his hospital all alone. "Page Dr. Chen in infectious diseases," he called out to a passing resident. "And get me the CDC on the line. We need to move fast." The hospital's emergency alarm system filled every corridor with its piercing wail. Red warning lights flashed rhythmically against the sterile white walls, casting an eerie glow throughout the building. Dr. Asher held Clara close as he strode purposefully toward the isolation ward, his mind already mapping out the necessary protocols. Behind them, the emergency room descended into controlled chaos. Patients in the waiting area pressed against the now locked doors, their faces masks of confusion and fear. Nurses worked quickly to distribute surgical masks and attempt to maintain order, their voices steady despite the rising tension. "Dr. Asher." Hospital Administrator Barbara Chen's sharp voice cut through the chaos. She hurried toward them, already wearing a protective mask. "What's the meaning of this? The board is demanding answers and we have reporters gathering outside." Dr. Asher shifted Clara in his arms, noting how she remained eerily quiet, her small hands still clutching her worn rabbit and a tiny cloth satchel. This child presented herself claiming to be positive. "Given the similarity to the initial case 5 years ago, I'm not taking any chances." Through the hospital's ground floor windows, camera flashes punctuated the growing darkness. News vans with their towering satellite dishes had already begun to line up along the street. Local reporters pressed their microphones against the glass, their faces eager for any glimpse of drama unfolding inside. "We need to start testing immediately," Dr. Asher continued, addressing both Barbara and the medical team that had assembled around them. "Full blood work, chest x-rays, and contact the CDC. We need to know if this is what we think it is." Clara watched the commotion with unnaturally calm eyes, her small face betraying no emotion. When a nurse approached with a needle for blood samples, she didn't flinch or cry out. Behavior Dr. Asher found both admirable and deeply troubling in someone so young. "The media's already running with the story," Barbara said, holding up her phone to show the breaking news alerts. "They're connecting it to the epidemic. Social media is exploding with speculation." The hospital's chief of medicine burst through the door of the isolation ward, his face flushed. "Asher, what evidence do you have to justify this level of response? Do you understand what this lockdown is costing us? With all due respect, sir, Dr. Asher replied firmly. I was here during the last outbreak. We lost precious time then because we didn't act quickly enough. I'm not making that mistake again. As if to emphasize his point, another wave of alarms sounded through the building, signaling the completion of the lockdown protocol. The ventilation system hummed as it switched to containment mode, and the heavy thud of securing doors echoed through the corridors. Clara stirred in Dr. Asher's arms, her first significant movement since the chaos began. She reached into her small satchel and withdrew a crumpled piece of paper. The doctor watched as she smoothed it carefully with her tiny hands, revealing what appeared to be a child's drawing. Through the observation window, reporters continued to film, their cameras catching glimpses of medical staff rushing back and forth in protective gear. Inside, the hospital staff moved with urgent precision, setting up isolation protocols and preparing for what could be another long battle against an invisible enemy. Dr. Asher looked down at Clara, who met his gaze with those impossibly old eyes. In all his years of medicine, he'd never seen a child so young carry such weight in their expression. Whatever story this little girl had to tell, he knew it was only beginning to unfold. Nurse Sarah Martinez approached Dr. Asher with Clara's small cloth satchel held carefully in her gloved hands. Doctor, we found this when we were preparing the patient's belongings for quarantine. Dr. Asher gently took the worn bag, noting how light it was. Clara watched intently from her hospital bed, her tiny frame dwarfed by the white sheets and medical equipment surrounding her. She hadn't spoken since her initial declaration in the emergency room. Inside the satchel, beneath a few crumpled drawings and a half-empty water bottle, lay a small notebook with tattered edges. The cover was faded blue, decorated with stick figure flowers drawn in crayon. Dr. Asher's heart tightened as he opened it, recognizing both adult and child's handwriting intermingled on the pages. Dr. Patel, he called to his colleague who was reviewing Clara's preliminary test results. You need to see this. Dr. Patel, a respected virologist who had worked alongside Dr. Asher during the previous epidemic, joined him at the nurse's station. Together, they began reading through the diary's entries. The first pages contained a mother's loving notes to her daughter, reminders about staying safe, being brave, and never losing hope. But as they progressed, the handwriting became increasingly unsteady. The later entries described familiar symptoms: fever, fatigue, the distinctive rash that had marked the epidemic's victims. Day 23, Dr. Asher read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. My darling Clara, the medicine isn't working anymore. Remember what I taught you about the safe places, about the people who can help. Dr. Patel leaned closer, his expression grave behind his protective mask. These dates, he said, pointing to the final entries. They're from after we thought the epidemic was contained. Look at this notation about the symptoms. It's different from what we documented. The last few pages contained Clara's own childish scrawl, detailing her journey through the city streets. Simple words described sleeping in doorways, finding food in dumpsters, and avoiding the bad people. But between these entries were curious symbols and numbers that seemed to follow a pattern. These markings, Dr. Patel said, pulling out his tablet to compare them with old research data. They're similar to the mutation patterns we tracked during the outbreak. But that's impossible. How would a child... Dr. Asher looked through the observation window at Clara, who was now drawing quietly in her bed. Her mother, he said softly. The diary mentions she worked in a research facility. What if she knew something? What if she was trying to tell us something through Clara? Dr. Patel's face paled as he cross-referenced more data. We need to run more tests, he said urgently. Not just the standard protocols, everything. Blood work, tissue samples, genetic markers. If what I'm seeing here is correct, this child could be carrying a variant we've never encountered. The diary's final entry was in Clara's unsteady handwriting. Mommy said find the doctor with the kind eyes. He will know what to do with the special medicine. Dr. Asher shared a concerned look with Dr. Patel. The implications of Clara's presence in their hospital suddenly seemed far more significant than they had initially feared. The girl wasn't just a potential carrier. She might be the key to understanding how the epidemic had evolved, and possibly how to stop it once and for all. The laboratory machines hummed steadily as Dr. Patel reviewed the final test results. His shoulders relaxed visibly as he studied the data on his computer screen. After hours of thorough testing and analysis, the truth was clear. Clara wasn't carrying any dangerous virus. "It's just severe malnutrition," Dr. Patel explained to Dr. Asher, who stood beside him in the lab. "The rashes are from exposure to the elements and poor hygiene. Nothing contagious." He pointed to several markers on the screen. "See these indicators? Classic signs of vitamin deficiency and protein malnutrition." Dr. Asher let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Relief flooded through him, but it was quickly replaced by a deep sadness. How long had this little girl been surviving on her own, scraping by with barely enough to eat? Within the hour, the hospital administration lifted the lockdown. Staff members removed their protective gear, and the tension that had gripped the building began to dissolve. In the hallways, nurses and doctors spoke in hushed tones about the false alarm, but no one seemed angry. Instead, there was a shared concern for the small child who had triggered it all. Dr. Asher made his way to Clara's room, where she sat cross-legged on the bed, carefully coloring in a picture book someone had brought her. She looked up as he entered, her eyes watchful but less guarded than before. "How are you feeling?" he asked, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "Okay," she whispered, her tiny fingers still clutching the crayon. "Am I in trouble?" "No, sweetheart, not at all." He noticed how she had arranged her crayons in perfect rows along the edge of her bed, a small attempt to create order in her chaotic world. "You're safe here." The words seemed to touch something deep within Clara. Her lower lip trembled slightly, and she looked down at her drawing. A simple house with a family standing in front of it. As Dr. Asher watched her, he felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. This wasn't just another patient. This was a child who had lost everything, who had somehow found her way to his hospital, to him. The medical crisis might be over, but Clara's story was far from finished. A social worker would need to be contacted. Forms would need to be filled out. The system would kick into gear, doing what it was designed to do for abandoned children. But as Dr. Asher observed Clara's careful, deliberate coloring, he couldn't shake the feeling that she needed more than just the system. "Would you like to tell me about your drawing?" he asked gently. Clara hesitated, then pointed to the figures she had drawn. "That's a doctor," she said softly, indicating the tallest stick figure. "He helps people." The simple statement hit Dr. Asher like a physical force. Here was a child who, despite everything she had endured, still believed in the goodness of others, still trusted that there were people who would help. Throughout the hospital, things were returning to normal. The media crews outside were packing up their equipment, and the regular flow of patients and visitors had resumed. But in room 204, something had changed permanently. Dr. Asher knew with absolute certainty that his connection to this brave little girl would extend far beyond this day. Over the next few days, Clara's small hospital room became her sanctuary. The nurses had decorated it with cheerful drawings, and a stuffed bear now sat faithfully by her pillow. Under Dr. Asher's careful supervision, she received the nutrients and care her body desperately needed. "Look who's getting stronger every day," Dr. Asher said warmly as he checked her vital signs one morning. Clara's cheeks had begun to show a hint of healthy color, and her eyes were brighter. "The food here is really good," Clara said softly, playing with the edge of her blanket. It was the most she'd spoken since her admission, and Dr. Asher smiled encouragingly. "What's your favorite so far?" "The chocolate pudding," she answered, a tiny smile tugging at her lips. "Mom used to make pudding sometimes, before." Her voice trailed off, but instead of withdrawing as she usually did when memories surfaced, she continued, "I learned to find food behind the grocery store. The nice lady there would leave bread for the birds, but she'd wink at me when she saw me." Dr. Asher's heart tightened at her matter-of-fact description of survival. "You're very resourceful, Clara." "Had to be," she shrugged, her small fingers now tracing patterns on the bear's fur. "The streets aren't so scary if you know where to hide and when to move." Their quiet conversations continued throughout the morning rounds. Clara slowly revealed pieces of her story, sleeping in cardboard boxes during rain, finding warm air vents in winter, keeping her mother's picture safe in her satchel. Each detail painted a picture of remarkable courage and determination. That afternoon, Dr. Asher's wife Grace and their daughter Lily came to visit. He had told them about Clara, and they had insisted on meeting her. As they approached the room, he could see Clara tense slightly through the window. "Clara," he said gently, "there are some people I'd like you to meet. Is that okay?" After a moment's hesitation, Clara nodded. Grace entered first, her warm smile lighting up the room. "Hello, Clara. I'm Grace, Dr. Asher's wife. I brought you something." She held up a small gift bag decorated with butterflies. 7-year-old Lily bounced in behind her mother, barely containing her excitement. "Hi, I'm Lily. I picked out the present myself." She paused, studying Clara with genuine interest. "I like your bear. Does he have a name?" Clara looked surprised by the question. "Not yet," she whispered. "Oh, you should definitely give him a name," Lily declared, climbing onto the foot of Clara's bed as if they were already friends. "My teddy is named Mr. Whiskers because his nose tickles." Grace placed the gift bag on Clara's lap. "Go ahead, sweetheart. Open it." With careful movements, Clara reached into the bag and pulled out a soft purple blanket with stars embroidered on it. Her fingers ran over the plush fabric in wonder. "It's so soft," she breathed, clutching it to her chest. "Every child needs their own special blanket," Grace said softly, her eyes meeting Dr. Asher's. They both saw how Clara's defensive posture had begun to relax, how she watched Lily's animated chatter with growing interest. "Do you like to draw?" Lily asked, pulling some markers from her backpack. "I brought my special coloring book. We could share." For the first time since she'd entered the hospital, Clara's smile reached her eyes. As she and Lily bent their heads together over the coloring book, Grace moved to stand beside her husband, their hands finding each other's instinctively. The pediatric ward hummed with gentle activity as nurses moved from room to room, their soft-soled shoes squeaking against the freshly polished floors. For Clara, each new sound and routine brought both comfort and uncertainty. The regular meals, clean sheets, and kind faces were so different from her life on the streets that sometimes it felt like a dream. From her bed by the window, Clara watched the other children in the ward. Some played board games in the common area, while others received visits from family members bearing balloons and stuffed animals. She pulled her new purple blanket closer, finding security in its soft warmth. "Would you like to join them?" a kind-faced nurse asked one morning, noticing Clara's attentive gaze. Clara quickly shook her head, shrinking back into her pillows, but her eyes never left the scene before her. Dr. Asher made a point to visit Clara several times throughout the day, not just during his regular rounds. He noticed how she tracked everything around her with watchful eyes, like a small bird ready to take flight at the first sign of danger. "You know," he said during one of his afternoon visits, pulling up his usual chair beside her bed, "Lily used to be afraid of thunderstorms." He adjusted Clara's IV line as he spoke, making his medical check seem casual and unthreatening. She would hide under her bed every time it rained. Clara's eyes flickered with interest, though she remained silent. "So we made it into a game," he continued, checking her temperature. "Every thunderclap became a dragon's roar, and we would count them together from her pillow fort." He smiled at the memory. "Now she gets excited when she sees storm clouds." A ghost of a smile crossed Clara's face, there and gone like a butterfly's wing. During his next visit, Dr. Asher brought more stories about Lily. "Yesterday, Lily tried to convince us that her vegetables would taste better if she arranged them into a smiley face," he shared, noting how Clara's shoulders relaxed slightly at the mention of his daughter. She spent 10 minutes making sure the carrot nose was just right. Clara's fingers played with the edge of her blanket, her usual nervous habit, but her eyes stayed fixed on Dr. Asher's face as he spoke. "And do you know what she did next?" he asked, pausing in his examination of her healing rashes. "She gave the face a mustache made of green beans." This time, Clara's smile lingered, small but real, like sunshine breaking through clouds. She didn't speak, but her body language had shifted from rigid wariness to cautious interest. The nurses noticed the change, too. "Dr. Asher has a way with the little ones," one whispered to another as they watched him leave Clara's room. "Did you see? She actually smiled today." "First time I've seen it," the other nurse replied softly. "Poor thing's been through so much." As the day drew to a close, Dr. Asher made one final visit. He found Clara drawing with some crayons the nurses had left her, her small face focused on her work. When she noticed him, instead of hiding the drawing as she usually did, she hesitantly turned it toward him. "Is that a dragon?" he asked gently. Clara nodded, and the smile that appeared on her face was the strongest yet. It was a small victory, but in the world of healing hearts and building trust, sometimes the smallest steps meant the most. Lily bounced on her toes as she waited for her mother to finish talking with the nurse at the pediatric ward's front desk. Her small hands clutched a homemade card decorated with glitter, stickers, and carefully drawn flowers. "Daddy says she's all alone," Lily had told Grace that morning while working on her masterpiece. "Everyone needs a friend, Mommy. Can we visit her, please?" Grace's heart had swelled with pride at her daughter's compassion. Now, watching Lily's eager anticipation, she knew they'd made the right choice in coming. "Remember what we talked about, sweetheart?" Grace knelt beside Lily, smoothing her daughter's dark curls. Clara might be a little shy at first. "I know, Mommy. Daddy said she's like a baby bird. We have to be extra gentle." Lily nodded solemnly, though her eyes sparkled with excitement. When they entered Clara's room, the smaller girl was sitting cross-legged on her bed, a half-eaten bowl of pudding on her tray. Clara's eyes widened at the sight of visitors, and she instinctively drew back against her pillows. "Hi, Clara." Lily's voice was bright but soft, just as she'd practiced at home. "I'm Lily, Dr. Asher's daughter. I made you something." Clara watched silently as Lily approached the bed, holding out the card like a peace offering. Grace stayed by the doorway, her presence calm and reassuring. "See? There's a rainbow and butterflies, and I put extra glitter on the flowers because everybody needs some sparkle when they're feeling sick." Lily carefully placed the card on Clara's blanket, giving the younger girl space to examine it. Clara's small fingers reached out tentatively to touch the glitter-covered surface. A few sparkles stuck to her fingertips, catching the afternoon light. "I have a whole box of art supplies at home," Lily continued, pulling up a chair next to the bed. "Daddy says you like to draw too. What's your favorite color?" "Mine's purple, but sometimes it's blue, especially when it's the same color as the sky." Clara glanced up at Lily, then back at the card. In a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I like yellow." Lily's face lit up at Clara's response. "Yellow's a happy color, like sunshine and daisies and baby chicks." She reached into her small backpack. "Want to see my favorite stuffed animal? His name is Mr. Whiskers." Clara nodded slightly, and Lily proudly displayed a well-loved stuffed rabbit with floppy ears. "He helps me feel better when I'm scared or sad," Lily explained, setting Mr. Whiskers gently on Clara's blanket. "You can hold him if you want." Clara hesitated before reaching out to stroke one of the rabbit's soft ears. A tiny smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. Grace watched the interaction from her spot by the door, her heart full. She saw how Clara's tense shoulders gradually relaxed as Lily chatted about her toys, her favorite games, and the treehouse in their backyard. When visiting hours came to an end, Lily carefully tucked Mr. Whiskers next to Clara's pillow. "He can stay with you tonight," she offered. "I have lots of other stuffed animals at home." That evening, after the nurses had dimmed the lights and checked her vital signs one last time, Clara lay in her hospital bed, one hand resting on Mr. Whiskers' soft fur, the other holding Lily's glitter-covered card. For the first time since arriving at the hospital, she fell asleep without fear of what tomorrow might bring. The next morning, Dr. Asher entered Clara's room for his usual checkup. He noticed Lily's glitter-covered card propped carefully on the bedside table, and Mr. Whiskers nestled securely beside Clara's pillow. "I see Lily shared her special friend with you," he said softly, pulling up a chair next to Clara's bed. The little girl nodded, her small fingers absently stroking the stuffed rabbit's ear. "You know," Dr. Asher continued, keeping his voice gentle and warm, "Lily's had Mr. Whiskers since she was 3. She takes him everywhere. He paused, watching Clara's reaction. That's what families do. They share the things they love with people they care about. Clara's hands stilled on the rabbit's fur. Her eyes remained fixed on her lap, but Dr. Asher could see her listening intently. "What do you think about Lily?" he asked carefully. Clara was quiet for a long moment. "She's nice," she whispered finally, her voice barely audible. "She is," Dr. Asher agreed, "and she's very excited to have a friend like you." He gestured to the card. "May I see what she made for you?" Clara hesitated before reaching for the card and carefully handing it to him. Dr. Asher noticed how she watched his every move, making sure he handled it gently. "This is beautiful," he said, admiring the abundance of glitter and stickers. "Lily loves making art. Do you like drawing too?" Clara gave a small nod. "You know, we have lots of art supplies at home," he mentioned casually. "Lily's always looking for someone to color with." At the word home, Clara's shoulders tensed slightly, and she withdrew further into herself. Dr. Asher recognized the sign. She wasn't ready to discuss that topic yet. He carefully placed the card back on her table. Later that afternoon, Lily burst into the room with her usual enthusiasm, carrying a small backpack. "I brought more friends for Mr. Whiskers," she announced, pulling out 2 more stuffed animals. "This is Mrs. Fluff and Baby Hop. They're his family." She arranged them carefully on Clara's bed. "They can all stay with you." Clara's eyes widened. "But they're yours," she protested quietly. "It's okay," Lily assured her. "They'll be happy here with you. And I can visit them, and you, every day." Clara looked from the stuffed animals to Lily's bright, sincere face. Slowly, she reached out and touched Mrs. Fluff's soft pink fur. That night, after the lights were dimmed and the ward grew quiet, Clara lay surrounded by her new plush companions. She held Mr. Whiskers close, breathing in the faint scent of Lily's home that still clung to his fur. For the first time in months, she didn't feel completely alone. One quiet afternoon, while Clara napped peacefully surrounded by her stuffed animal friends, Lily busied herself organizing Clara's bedside table. She hummed softly as she straightened the get well cards and arranged the small collection of toys she'd brought over the past few days. As she moved a box of crayons, a crumpled piece of paper fell to the floor. Lily picked it up, carefully smoothing out the wrinkles. Her eyes widened as she studied the drawing. The paper revealed a simple but touching scene drawn in crayon. A house with a red roof and blue windows stood in the center, smoke curling from the chimney. In front of the house stood 4 stick figures holding hands, 2 tall ones and 2 small ones. The sun smiled down from the corner of the page, and flowers dotted the green grass below. Lily's fingers traced the careful lines, noticing how one of the smaller figures wore the same blue hospital gown that Clara wore. Her heart squeezed with understanding as she realized what the drawing meant. "Mommy, Daddy!" Lily called out excitedly, though not too loudly to wake Clara. She rushed out of the room, clutching the drawing carefully against her chest. She found her parents talking quietly in the hallway outside Clara's room. Dr. Asher was still in his white coat, having just finished his rounds, while Grace stood close beside him. "Look what I found!" Lily held up the drawing, her eyes bright with excitement. "Clara drew this." Grace knelt down to look at the picture more closely, her expression softening as she took in the details. Dr. Asher leaned in too, his hand resting gently on his wife's shoulder. "She wants a family like ours," Lily declared, pointing to the stick figures. "See? There's a mommy and daddy and 2 little girls just like us." Grace and Dr. Asher exchanged meaningful looks over their daughter's head. In that simple crayon drawing, Clara had revealed more about her deepest wishes than she had in all her quiet days at the hospital. Later that evening, after Lily had gone home with Grace, Dr. Asher sat in his office, staring at Clara's drawing. Grace had returned to the hospital to bring him dinner, knowing he would be working late as usual. "James," Grace said softly, placing a hand on her husband's shoulder, "that drawing says everything we need to know. She needs us." Dr. Asher rubbed his tired eyes. "I know, but my schedule is already so demanding. Would it be fair to her? To any of us?" He gestured at the stack of patient files on his desk. "I'm barely home as it is." "We could make it work," Grace insisted, pulling up a chair beside him. Maybe this is exactly what we all need. Clara needs a family, and we have so much love to give. Down the hallway, Clara lay in her hospital bed, unable to sleep. The quiet whispers of nurses and the soft beeping of machines couldn't mask the familiar voices drifting from Dr. Asher's office. Though she couldn't make out every word, phrases like foster care and adoption reached her ears. Her heart beat faster and she clutched Lily's stuffed animal tighter. Clara had learned the hard way not to trust in good things. They never lasted. Her mother's warm hugs, their tiny apartment, the promise of always being together, all of it had disappeared. Dr. Asher's footsteps approached her room for his evening rounds. He entered quietly, thinking she was asleep. Clara kept her eyes closed, but she could feel his presence as he checked her vital signs. "I know you're awake," he said gently, sitting in the chair beside her bed. "You're breathing too fast to be sleeping." Clara opened her eyes slowly, meeting his kind gaze. "I heard you talking," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dr. Asher nodded, taking her small hand in his. "I know you've been hurt before, Clara. I know it's hard to believe in promises." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I want you to know something. You won't be alone anymore. No matter what happens, we'll make sure of that." Clara's fingers tightened slightly around his hand, but her expression remained guarded. She'd heard promises before. Still, something in Dr. Asher's voice made her want to believe him, even as her mind warned her not to. She turned her face away, protecting herself from the hope that threatened to bloom in her chest. But she didn't let go of his hand. The morning started like any other, with Clara taking her usual medications, but within minutes her face began to flush and her breathing became labored. The monitors beside her bed started beeping urgently. Dr. Asher rushed into the room, his heart dropping at the sight of Clara's swollen face and neck. "She's having an anaphylactic reaction," he called out to the nurses. "Get me epinephrine, stat." Lily, who had been coloring with Clara moments before, refused to move from her spot beside the bed. Her small hand gripped Clara's tightly as nurses and doctors swarmed around them. "Sweetie, you need to step back," Grace urged, trying to pull her daughter away. "No," Lily's voice was firm. "I promised Clara I wouldn't leave her." Clara's eyes were wide with fear as she struggled to breathe. Through her wheezing, she managed to whisper to Lily, "Don't leave me." The words were barely audible, but they pierced everyone's hearts. Dr. Asher worked quickly, his hands steady despite his internal panic. He administered the epinephrine while monitoring Clara's vitals. "Come on, sweetheart," he murmured, watching the monitors intently. "Fight this." Grace stood at the foot of the bed, her hands clasped in prayer. The minutes felt like hours as they waited for Clara's breathing to ease. Lily never let go of Clara's hand, speaking softly to her friend about the tea party they would have when she felt better. Gradually, the medication began to work. Clara's breathing became less labored, and the swelling started to subside. The tension in the room slowly dissolved as her vital signs stabilized. Dr. Asher slumped into a chair, exhausted but relieved. He watched as Lily gently wiped Clara's forehead with a cool cloth, showing a maturity beyond her years. Grace moved to stand behind her husband, placing her hands on his shoulders. "We can't let her go," Grace whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "She needs us." Dr. Asher nodded, watching Clara drift into a peaceful sleep, her hand still firmly held by Lily. The crisis had made one thing crystal clear. Clara wasn't just a patient anymore. She was already part of their family. "We'll start the adoption paperwork tomorrow," he said quietly, his decision final. The sight of his daughter's unwavering devotion to Clara and Clara's trust in Lily had erased any lingering doubts. That evening, after Clara had fallen asleep, Dr. Asher and Grace sat in the hospital's quiet family room. The day's events had left them both emotionally drained but determined. "I can't stop thinking about how scared she looked during the reaction," Grace said softly, her hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm coffee. "And how she reached for Lily." Dr. Asher rubbed his tired eyes. "I know. But Grace, are we ready for this? My schedule at the hospital is already so demanding." Grace reached across the table and took his hand. We'll figure it out together. Maybe it's time to reduce your hours slightly. We have savings, and Clara needs us. Her voice was gentle but firm. Think about how far she's come already just from being around our family. In Clara's room, Lily perched on the edge of the bed, chattering excitedly about life at home. Every Friday we have movie night, she explained, her eyes bright. Daddy makes popcorn and Mommy builds a blanket fort in the living room. Clara listened intently, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her hospital blanket. When you get better, you can pick the movie too, Lily continued. Do you like Disney movies? Clara hesitated, then gave a small nod. Her shy smile made Lily beam with happiness. Later that afternoon, Ms. Thompson, a social worker with kind eyes and a warm smile, met with Dr. Asher and Grace in her office. She spread several forms across her desk. The fostering process typically begins with a home study, Ms. Thompson explained, pointing to various documents. We'll need to verify your financial stability, complete background checks, and ensure your home meets all safety requirements. How long does the process usually take? Grace asked, already reaching for a pen. It varies, but given Clara's situation and your qualifications, we can expedite certain steps. Ms. Thompson smiled reassuringly. The most important thing is that Clara already shows a strong attachment to your family, which is incredibly positive for her healing process. Dr. Asher leaned forward, his voice determined. We'll do whatever it takes. That little girl deserves a family who loves her. Grace squeezed his hand as they began filling out the preliminary paperwork, taking their first official steps toward bringing Clara home. Clara sat in her hospital bed, absently stroking the stuffed animal Lily had given her. Through the partially open door, she could hear Dr. Asher's voice talking with Ms. Thompson in the hallway. We want to make sure the transition is smooth for Clara, Dr. Asher was saying. After everything she's been through, the word transition made Clara's stomach tighten. Memories flooded back. Her mother's pale face in the hospital bed, the empty apartment, the cold nights on the street. Her small fingers gripped the stuffed animal tighter as tears welled up in her eyes. Over the next few days, Clara grew quieter. When Lily came to visit, she only nodded or shook her head. Even during Dr. Asher's regular checkups, she kept her eyes fixed on her blanket. Dr. Asher noticed the change. One afternoon, while checking her vital signs, he pulled up a chair next to her bed. Clara, he said gently, I can tell something's bothering you. Would you like to talk about it? Clara shook her head at first, but Dr. Asher waited patiently. Finally, in a whisper so soft he had to lean in to hear, she spoke. Mommy said she'd never leave. Clara's voice trembled. But she did. Dr. Asher's heart ached as he watched tears roll down Clara's cheeks. The doctors couldn't make her better, Clara continued, her words coming faster now. She got so sick, and then... Her small body began to shake with sobs she'd held in for so long. Dr. Asher carefully took her tiny hand in his. I'm so sorry about your mom, Clara. That must have been very scary and sad. Clara nodded, wiping her eyes with her free hand. What if you leave too? I know you're scared, Dr. Asher said softly, squeezing her hand. And it's okay to be scared. But I want you to know that you're safe with us. We're going to take care of you. Clara looked at him through tear-filled eyes, wanting to believe him but still held back by fear. She didn't pull her hand away, but her uncertainty showed in her trembling lower lip and the way she clutched her stuffed animal closer with her other hand. The morning sun streamed through the hospital window as Lily bounced excitedly on her toes. She had been planning this surprise for days, and now everything was ready. Her mother, Grace, carefully carried a homemade chocolate cake, while Lily clutched a bundle of colorful balloons. Do you think she'll like it? Lily whispered to her mother. I'm sure she will, sweetheart, Grace answered with a warm smile. Dr. Asher opened the door to Clara's room, where the small girl sat reading a book Lily had brought her earlier that week. Her eyes widened at the sight of the balloons and decorations. Happy birthday, Lily exclaimed, rushing forward. Since it's my birthday today, I wanted to share it with you. Clara's mouth opened in surprise as she watched Grace set the cake on the bedside table. The frosting spelled out, "Happy Birthday, Lily and Clara," in wobbly letters, clearly decorated by Lily herself. I get to celebrate too?" Clara asked in a small voice. "Of course." Lily climbed onto the bed next to Clara. "Everyone deserves a birthday party." Grace hung streamers while Dr. Asher helped arrange the balloons. Clara watched it all with wonder, her fingers twisting in her blanket. When Grace lit the candles, the warm glow reflected in Clara's eyes. "Make a wish," Lily encouraged, taking Clara's hand. "That's the most important part." Clara looked at the flickering candles, then at the faces around her. Lily's excited grin, Grace's gentle smile, and Dr. Asher's kind eyes. She closed her eyes tightly, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope. With a small puff of breath, she blew out the candles alongside Lily. In that moment, as everyone clapped and Grace began cutting the cake, Clara's wish floated silently in her heart. A wish for the one thing she wanted most: a family. Dr. Asher stood before the hospital board, his normally calm demeanor tested by their stern faces and cold stares. The boardroom felt suffocating, with its dark wood panels and heavy silence. "Dr. Asher, your dedication to this single patient is affecting your other responsibilities," Dr. Matthews, the board chairman, said sharply. "3 surgeries reassigned this week alone." "With all due respect," Dr. Asher replied, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Clara's case requires special attention." "She's stable now," another board member cut in. "The social workers can handle it from here." Dr. Asher's phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from Grace. He'd called her earlier, worried about the meeting. Her response made him smile slightly. "Remember what matters most. We're with you." "Your emotional attachment to this child is clouding your judgment," Dr. Matthews continued. "This hospital needs your full attention." Dr. Asher straightened his shoulders, Grace's words giving him strength. "Clara isn't just another case file. She's a 5-year-old girl who needs more than just medical care. She needs stability, protection, and love." "That's not your responsibility," Dr. Matthews insisted, his voice rising. "You're a surgeon, not a social worker." "I'm also a human being," Dr. Asher responded firmly, "and a father. I won't apologize for caring about my patients beyond their medical charts." The board members exchanged uncomfortable glances as Dr. Asher continued. "I've served this hospital faithfully for 15 years. My record speaks for itself. But if you're asking me to choose between being a good doctor and being a good person, well, that's not really a choice at all." He placed his hands on the table, looking each board member in the eye. "I'm not neglecting my duties. I'm fulfilling them, all of them. Clara stays under my care, and I'll continue to be there for her as both her doctor and, hopefully soon, her father." The silence that followed was deafening, but Dr. Asher remained standing tall, his decision unwavering. In his mind, he could see Grace's proud smile and feel the strength of her support. Some battles were worth fighting, and this was one of them. The pediatric ward's afternoon light filtered through the window as Lily burst into Clara's room, her arms full of colorful books and a worn teddy bear. Clara's eyes lit up at the sight of her friend, though she tried to hide her excitement behind her usual shy smile. "Look what I brought," Lily exclaimed, dumping her treasures onto Clara's bed. "These are my favorite stories. And guess what? We can build a super cool fort." Clara watched in amazement as Lily started gathering extra blankets from the supply closet. The nurses, used to Lily's presence by now, just smiled and shook their heads fondly. "Here, hold this corner," Lily instructed, passing Clara the edge of a soft blue blanket. Together, they draped blankets over chairs and the side of Clara's bed, creating a cozy hideaway. Lily's infectious giggles filled the room as they crawled inside with flashlights. "This is just like camping," Lily declared, spreading out her books. "This one's about a magical garden. Want to read it together?" As they flipped through pages of beautiful illustrations, Clara's usual guardedness began to melt away. The fort felt safe, like a secret world just for them. During a quiet moment between stories, Clara hugged her knees to her chest. "I used to read with my mama," she whispered, her voice small but steady. She liked garden stories too. Lily set down the book, listening intently as Clara continued. She'd make different voices for all the flowers. I miss her a lot. I bet she was really nice, Lily said softly, scooting closer to Clara. You know what? Now you can read with me whenever you want. I promise I'll always be here to play with you and read stories. Clara's eyes welled with tears, but for the first time in a long while, they weren't entirely sad tears. Lily wrapped her arms around Clara in a tight hug, and Clara didn't pull away. The afternoon drifted into evening as they read more stories, shared secrets, and giggled under their blanket ceiling. The soft glow of their flashlights created dancing shadows on the fort walls. Eventually, their voices grew quieter, their words more sleepy. They curled up on the pile of pillows they'd arranged, Clara clutching Lily's teddy bear and Lily still holding one of her favorite books. As they drifted off to sleep, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced since losing her mother, the warmth of having someone to call family. The morning started like any other until Clara's monitors began blaring their harsh warning. Her temperature had spiked dangerously high, and her breathing became labored. Dr. Asher rushed to her bedside, his heart pounding as he assessed her deteriorating condition. "Get Dr. Patel and Prepper 3, he ordered, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his chest. "We need to operate now." In the waiting room, Grace held Lily close as they watched the medical team wheel Clara away. Lily's small hands clutched her mother's sweater. "Is Clara going to be okay, Mommy?" "We have to be brave for her," Grace whispered, fighting back tears. "Daddy's going to take good care of her." Inside the operating room, Dr. Asher worked methodically alongside Dr. Patel and the hospital's best specialists. The procedure was delicate, requiring precision and speed. Sweat beaded on Dr. Asher's forehead as he focused on saving the little girl who had become so precious to his family. "BP's dropping," a nurse called out. The monitors beeped urgently as Clara's vital signs wavered. "Come on, Clara," Dr. Asher murmured, his hands steady even as his heart raced. "Stay with us, sweetheart." For several tense hours, the medical team worked tirelessly. Each time Clara's vitals dipped, they fought harder to bring her back. Dr. Patel's expertise proved invaluable as he assisted Dr. Asher through the most critical moments. Outside in the waiting room, Grace and Lily sat huddled together, saying quiet prayers. Lily had drawn a picture of Clara surrounded by hearts, holding it close like a talisman. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the procedure was complete. Clara's condition stabilized, though she remained fragile. Dr. Asher stepped back from the operating table, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion and relief. He removed his surgical mask and gloves, his hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline subsided. The emotional weight of operating on Clara, not just a patient, but a child he'd grown to love, hit him full force. "She's strong," Dr. Patel said, placing a supportive hand on his colleague's shoulder. "She's going to pull through." Dr. Asher nodded, taking a deep breath before heading to the waiting room to share the news with his family. His scrubs were wrinkled, his face etched with fatigue, but his eyes held hope as he pushed open the waiting room door. The days following Clara's surgery were filled with small but meaningful victories. She lay in her hospital bed, pale but fighting, while machines quietly monitored her recovery. Dr. Asher checked her vitals frequently, his gentle touch and warm smile offering comfort even when she felt her weakest. Grace brought fresh flowers every morning, filling the sterile room with splashes of color. She would sit beside Clara for hours, reading stories or simply holding her tiny hand. Sometimes when Clara dozed off, Grace would smooth her hair and hum soft lullabies. "Look what we made for you!" Lily burst into the room one afternoon, carrying a stack of colorful papers. She spread them across Clara's blanket, revealing dozens of handmade cards. "Everyone in the kids' ward helped." Clara's eyes widened as she looked at each card. There were wobbly drawings of hearts, rainbow-colored flowers, and messages written in crayon. "This one's from Tommy in room 204, Lily explained, pointing to a card with a bright yellow sun. "And Sarah from the playroom made this one with the butterflies." Dr. Asher watched from the doorway as Clara carefully touched each card, a small smile playing on her lips. It was the most animated she'd been since the surgery. A week after the operation, Clara's physical therapy began. "Ready to try standing?" Dr. Asher asked, holding out his hands. Clara nodded, determination clear in her eyes despite her apprehension. Grace stood nearby, ready to help if needed, while Lily watched with excited anticipation. Clara's small fingers gripped Dr. Asher's hands as she slowly pushed herself up. Her legs trembled with the effort, but she didn't give up. "That's it, sweetheart," Dr. Asher encouraged, supporting her weight. "You're doing great." Clara took one shaky step, then another, her grip tight on Dr. Asher's hands. Though the distance was short, each step represented a triumph over her recent ordeal. Lily clapped enthusiastically while Grace wiped happy tears from her eyes. "I'm walking," Clara whispered, looking up at Dr. Asher with wonder in her eyes. "Yes, you are," he replied softly, his heart swelling with pride and love. "And we're right here with you, every step of the way." Dr. Asher and Grace sat in the social worker's office, surrounded by stacks of paperwork. Ms. Thompson, the social worker, walked them through each document with careful attention. "These forms begin the formal adoption process," Ms. Thompson explained, sliding another paper across her desk. "We'll need to conduct home visits and background checks as part of the evaluation." Grace squeezed her husband's hand as they signed document after document. Their commitment to Clara grew stronger with each signature. Meanwhile, in her hospital room, Clara sat quietly on her bed, hugging the stuffed animal Lily had given her. She could hear snippets of conversation from the hallway about adoption and forever home. Her small fingers twisted nervously in the soft fur of the toy. When Dr. Asher and Grace returned to her room, Clara's anxiety was visible in her hunched shoulders and downcast eyes. "Clara, sweetheart," Grace said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Would you like to talk about what's bothering you?" Clara's lip trembled. "What if," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "what if I'm not good enough?" Grace's heart ached at the vulnerability in Clara's words. "Can I tell you something about families?" she asked, gently taking Clara's small hand in hers. "Real families aren't about being perfect. They're about love." Clara looked up, her eyes wet with unshed tears. "But what if I do something wrong?" "Then we'll help you make it right," Grace answered, her voice warm and steady. "Just like when Lily accidentally broke my favorite vase last month. We cleaned it up together, and you know what? The vase didn't matter, Lily's heart mattered more." Dr. Asher moved closer, his presence reassuring. "Everyone makes mistakes, Clara. That's part of being human. But family means we face those mistakes together." "Really?" Clara's voice held a glimmer of hope. Grace smiled, wrapping her arm around Clara's shoulders. "Really, being a family isn't about being perfect. It's about loving each other, supporting each other, and growing together. And we already love you just as you are." Clara leaned into Grace's embrace, her rigid posture slowly relaxing. For the first time since hearing about the adoption, she allowed herself to imagine being part of the Asher family, not as a perfect child, but as herself. The Asher home buzzed with warm energy as friends and hospital staff gathered in the cozy living room. Streamers and balloons decorated the walls, and a hand-painted banner reading "Welcome Clara" hung above the fireplace. Clara stood close to Grace, her small fingers gripping the hem of Grace's sweater. The attention from so many people made her want to hide, but Lily's excited presence beside her helped steady her nerves. "Look, Clara," Lily pointed to Dr. Patel, who was chatting with other hospital staff. "Even Dr. Patel came to celebrate with us." Dr. Asher noticed Clara's uncertainty and knelt beside her. "Everyone here cares about you, sweetheart. They've all been part of your journey." Slowly, Clara began to notice the genuine smiles directed her way. The pediatric nurses who had cared for her waved warmly, and some of her favorite hospital staff members shared stories about her recovery that made everyone laugh. "Remember when you taught Nurse Jenny how to make paper cranes?" one of the nurses called out, making Clara smile shyly. As the afternoon progressed, Clara's grip on Grace's sweater loosened. She found herself giggling at Lily's jokes and accepting gentle hugs from well-wishers. The love in the room was palpable, wrapping around her like a warm blanket. Grace brought out a beautiful chocolate cake decorated with colorful flowers and 5 sparkling candles. The room dimmed, and everyone gathered around, singing, "For she's a jolly good fellow." Clara's eyes widened at the sight of the cake, her face glowing in the candlelight. "Make a wish, Clara," Lily whispered excitedly, squeezing her hand. Clara looked around at the smiling faces, at Dr. Asher's proud expression, Grace's loving gaze, and Lily's boundless enthusiasm. For the first time in her young life, she didn't need to wish for a family. Instead, she closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and blew out the candles while everyone cheered. The pure joy on Clara's face as she opened her eyes reflected the light and love surrounding her, a stark contrast to the scared little girl who had first entered the hospital doors. Later that evening, after the party guests had left, Clara sat on the living room couch, holding one of her mother's old hair ribbons that she kept in her satchel. Dr. Asher noticed her quiet contemplation and sat beside her. "What are you thinking about, Clara?" he asked gently. Clara ran her fingers over the faded ribbon. "Mommy used to tell me stories before bed," she said softly. "She made up the best ones." Dr. Asher listened intently as Clara's voice grew stronger. "She told me about magical families that were as big as the sky," Clara continued. "She said one day I'd find a family as big as my dreams." Tears welled up in Clara's eyes. She promised we'd always be together, but then she got so sick. Dr. Asher's heart ached as he watched Clara struggle with her memories. Later that night, after tucking Clara into bed, he went to his home office and began searching through hospital records. What he found made his chest tighten: documentation of Clara's mother's death from a treatable illness, made fatal by lack of access to medical care. Reports of a small child seen wandering the streets, too quick to be caught by social services. He found newspaper clippings about homeless children in the city, and police reports of a little girl sleeping in cardboard boxes behind restaurants. Each piece of information painted a clearer picture of Clara's desperate survival on the streets. Sitting in his dimly lit office, Dr. Asher thought about Clara's mother and her stories of finding a family. He thought about the strength it must have taken for that dying woman to give her daughter hope for the future. Looking at a photo of Clara on his desk, one taken just that afternoon at the party, he made a silent, powerful promise. "I'll give her the family you dreamed of," he whispered to Clara's mother's memory. "I'll make sure she never feels alone again." The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, its official seal making Grace's hands tremble as she opened it. Dr. Asher stood beside her, his arm wrapped around her shoulders as they read the contents together. "The hearing is set for next month," Grace said, her voice filled with emotion. "We're finally going to make it official." In the living room, Clara sat quietly on the couch, watching the excitement on their faces. Her small fingers twisted nervously in her lap as Dr. Asher knelt before her. "Clara, sweetheart," he said gently, "in just a few weeks we'll go to the courthouse. The judge will make you officially part of our family." Clara's eyes widened, a mix of hope and fear crossing her face. "Really?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Forever and ever?" "Forever and ever," Grace confirmed, sitting beside her and pulling her close. Lily, who had been bouncing with excitement, suddenly ran to her room. "Wait right there," she called out. "I have an idea." She returned moments later with her art supplies, spreading them across the coffee table. "Let's make a family picture," she announced, pulling Clara down to sit beside her on the floor. "See, here's Daddy with his doctor coat and Mommy with her garden hat and me with my pigtails." Clara watched as Lily's crayon moved across the paper, creating colorful stick figures. "And here's you," Lily said, drawing another figure between herself and their parents. "Right in the middle, where you belong." Tears welled up in Clara's eyes as she watched the portrait take shape. Lily added details: their house in the background, the family dog they'd been talking about getting, and even the tree in their backyard where they planned to build a swing set. "Now you draw something too," Lily insisted, handing Clara a crayon. With a shaky hand, Clara added a bright yellow sun in the corner, its rays extending down to touch each family member. Dr. Asher and Grace watched their daughters work together, their hearts full as they saw Clara's tension slowly melt away. When the picture was complete, Lily proudly held it up. "See," she said, "this is us. All of us together." Clara took the drawing with careful hands, studying each figure. Her fingers traced over the stick figure version of herself, standing hand in hand with her new family. For the first time since hearing about the adoption hearing, a genuine smile spread across her face. "Can I keep it?" she asked softly. "Of course you can, sweetheart," Grace answered, watching as Clara hugged the drawing close to her chest. "That's your first official family portrait." The hospital boardroom felt cold and sterile as Dr. Asher faced the stern faces of the board members. Chairman Wilson's voice cut through the tension like ice. "Your dedication to this child has affected your performance, Dr. Asher. 3 surgeries reassigned, clinic hours reduced, and constant distractions. This cannot continue." Dr. Asher stood firm, his hands steady on the back of his chair. "With all due respect, I haven't missed a single critical case. My team has managed perfectly well, and my commitment to this hospital remains unwavering." Meanwhile, at home, Grace sat with Clara at the kitchen table, gently helping her practice for tomorrow's hearing. Clara's small hands fidgeted with the hem of her dress. "Remember, sweetie, you just need to be honest," Grace said softly. "The judge only wants to know how you feel about becoming part of our family." Lily, sitting cross-legged in the chair next to Clara, nodded enthusiastically. "It's easy. Just tell them what you told me, that you want to stay with us forever and ever." Clara's voice came out barely above a whisper. "What if I say something wrong?" "There are no wrong answers," Grace assured her, squeezing her hand. "Just speak from your heart." Back at the hospital, Dr. Asher gathered his belongings after standing his ground. "I won't apologize for caring about Clara," he had told the board. "Some things are worth fighting for." When he arrived home that evening, he found Clara sitting alone on the porch swing, clutching Lily's family portrait. Her eyes were worried as she looked up at him. "Are you in trouble because of me?" she asked quietly. Dr. Asher sat beside her, the swing creaking gently. "No, sweetheart. Some people just don't understand that being a doctor means caring for the whole person, not just their illness." Clara's lower lip trembled. "What if something goes wrong tomorrow?" "Look at me," Dr. Asher said gently, turning to face her. "Tomorrow, we're going to walk into that courthouse as a family, together, and nothing anyone says or does can change how much we love you." Clara leaned into his side, still holding the drawing close. "Promise?" "I promise," he whispered, wrapping his arm around her small shoulders. "We're in this together. All of us." The morning sunlight streamed through Clara's bedroom window as Grace helped her into the new dress Lily had picked out. It was pale blue with tiny white flowers, and Clara ran her fingers over the soft fabric with wonder. "You look like a princess," Lily exclaimed, bouncing on her toes. She wore a matching dress, insisting they should look like real sisters. "And look, I made us matching ribbons too." Grace carefully tied the white ribbon in Clara's hair, her gentle hand steady despite the emotion she felt building in her chest. "There we go, sweetheart. Perfect." Dr. Asher appeared in the doorway, already in his best suit. His eyes grew misty as he took in the sight of Clara in her new dress. "Ready for our big day?" Clara nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her dress. The drive to the courthouse felt both too long and too short. Clara sat between Lily and Grace in the back seat, while Dr. Asher drove carefully through the morning traffic. "Remember what we practiced?" Lily whispered, squeezing Clara's hand. "Just tell the truth about how much you want to be my sister." The courthouse loomed large and imposing, its stone steps seeming to stretch endlessly upward. Clara's steps faltered as they approached the entrance. Dr. Asher noticed immediately and knelt down beside her. "It's okay to be nervous," he said softly. "We're all a little nervous too, but we're right here with you." Inside, the courthouse hallway buzzed with activity. Men and women in suits rushed past, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Clara pressed closer to Grace, who kept a protective arm around her shoulders. The courtroom itself was bigger than Clara had imagined. Dark wooden benches stretched in neat rows and flags stood tall behind the judge's bench. Their footsteps seemed too loud as they made their way to the front. "Look at all the pretty windows," Lily whispered. pointing to the tall stained glass that cast colorful patterns on the floor. Her attempt to distract Clara brought a tiny smile to the younger girl's face. They sat together in the front row, Clara between Grace and Lily, with Dr. Asher on Grace's other side. Their lawyer, Mrs. Martinez, gave them a reassuring nod from her position at the table in front of them. Clara's heart began to race as more people filed into the courtroom. There was the social worker who had visited their house, some court officials she didn't recognize, and even Dr. Patel, who had come to show his support. The bailiff's voice suddenly rang out, "All rise, the Honorable Judge Sarah Thompson presiding." Everyone stood. Clara gripped Lily's hand tightly as the judge entered, her black robe swishing as she walked to her seat. Judge Thompson had kind eyes behind her glasses, but Clara still felt her stomach flutter with butterflies. "Please be seated," the judge announced, and the rustle of movement filled the room. Clara sat very still, her small hand still firmly clasped in Lily's, as the judge settled into her chair and began arranging papers on her desk. This was the moment that would change everything, and despite all their preparation, Clara felt her heart thundering in her chest. The social worker, Ms. Reynolds, stood before the court, her voice steady and clear as she presented Clara's case. She held up a worn manila folder, filled with documents that traced Clara's difficult journey. "Your Honor, when Clara first arrived at Memorial Hospital, she was severely malnourished and had been living on the streets for months following her mother's passing," Ms. Reynolds explained. "The documentation shows she had no living relatives to care for her." Clara listened quietly, her small fingers still intertwined with Lily's. Grace noticed her trembling slightly and placed a gentle hand on her back. "During her time at the hospital," Ms. Reynolds continued, "Clara formed an extraordinary bond with Dr. Asher and his family. They've provided her with not just physical care, but the emotional support she desperately needed." The social worker detailed her home visits, describing how Clara had flourished in the Asher household. "I've witnessed firsthand how Lily has become like a sister to Clara, how Mrs. Asher has created a nurturing environment, and how Dr. Asher has gone above and beyond his role as a physician to ensure Clara's well-being." Judge Thompson nodded thoughtfully, then turned her attention to Clara. "Clara, would you like to tell me how you feel about the Ashers?" Clara's breath caught in her throat. She looked up at Grace, who gave her an encouraging smile, then at Dr. Asher, whose eyes were filled with warmth. Slowly, she stood up, her voice barely a whisper at first. When I was alone, I was really scared," Clara began, her voice growing slightly stronger. "But Dr. Asher helped me get better. He told me stories and made me feel safe." She glanced at Lily, who beamed back at her. "Lily gave me her favorite teddy bear and made me cards. She said she always wanted a sister." Clara's voice wobbled slightly. "And Mrs. Asher? She hugs me when I have bad dreams and makes me feel warm inside like my mommy used to do." Tears began to roll down Clara's cheeks, but she kept speaking, her words coming straight from her heart. They make me feel like I belong somewhere again, like I'm not alone anymore." The courtroom was completely silent as Clara's voice cracked with emotion. "I just want a family to love me back," she said, tears falling freely now. "And they already do." Grace wiped tears from her own eyes while Dr. Asher's jaw clenched with emotion. Lily squeezed Clara's hand tighter, and even Ms. Reynolds dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The judge's expression softened as she watched this small, brave girl pour out her heart. The impact of Clara's words hung in the air, filling the courtroom with a profound silence. Several people in the gallery could be heard sniffling, moved by the raw honesty of Clara's testimony. The simple truth of her words, "I just want a family to love me back," seemed to echo in everyone's hearts, a reminder of the fundamental human need for love and belonging. Judge Thompson leaned forward in her chair, her hands folded thoughtfully on the bench before her. The courtroom remained silent, every breath held in anticipation of her words. "In my years serving on this bench," she began, her voice carrying a gentle weight, "I've seen many cases involving children who have faced unimaginable hardships. Each one reminds us of our duty to ensure these young souls find the stability and love they deserve." She paused, looking directly at Clara, who was still holding Lily's hand tightly. Clara's journey has been particularly moving. A child who showed remarkable courage in the face of loss, who found her way to safety through her own determination, and who, despite her young age, demonstrated wisdom beyond her years in recognizing where she might find help. The judge's gaze shifted to Dr. Asher and Grace. The reports before me show a family that has opened their hearts completely. Dr. Asher's dedication to Clara's care went far beyond professional obligation, demonstrating the kind of parental devotion every child needs. Mrs. Asher has provided the nurturing environment essential for Clara's emotional healing, while young Lily has shown us all what pure, unconditional sisterly love looks like. Judge Thompson picked up her gavel, and the tension in the room grew palpable. Clara's grip on Lily's hand tightened, and Grace reached over to squeeze Dr. Asher's arm. The judge's serious expression slowly transformed into a warm smile. "It gives me great pleasure," she announced, her voice filled with warmth, "to approve this adoption petition. From this day forward, Clara will legally be a member of the Asher family." The sound of the gavel striking echoed through the courtroom, but it was quickly drowned out by spontaneous applause and joyful exclamations. Grace burst into happy tears, pulling Clara into a tight embrace. Dr. Asher's usually composed demeanor cracked as tears welled in his eyes. Lily couldn't contain her excitement. She jumped up from her seat, her face beaming with pure joy. "You're my sister now," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around Clara and Grace. "You're really, really my sister." Clara's small frame shook with emotion as she found herself surrounded by her new family's embrace. Dr. Asher knelt down beside them, wrapping his strong arms around them all. Tears streamed down Clara's face, but for the first time in her young life, they were tears of absolute joy. The judge watched the scene with misty eyes, witnessing the moment a family was made complete. The social worker dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, smiling at the successful conclusion of Clara's journey from tragedy to triumph. In the middle of their group hug, Clara looked up at Dr. Asher and Grace, her eyes shining with tears and wonder. "I have a family," she whispered, as if saying it aloud would make it more real. "I really have a family." "Forever and ever," Lily declared, squeezing her new sister even tighter. "That's how long you're stuck with us." Grace smoothed Clara's hair, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "That's right, sweetheart. Forever and ever." Dr. Asher's voice was thick with emotion as he looked at his now complete family. "Welcome home, Clara Asher," he said softly, the new name falling naturally from his lips. The courtroom continued to buzz with joy and celebration, but for Clara, the whole world had narrowed to this single perfect moment, wrapped in the arms of her new family, finally home where she belonged. The Asher family's car pulled into their driveway, and Clara pressed her small hands against the window, taking in the sight of her new home. It was a welcoming two-story house with bright flowers lining the walkway and a tire swing swaying gently in the front yard. "Welcome home, sweetheart," Grace said softly, turning in her seat to smile at Clara. Lily could barely contain her excitement, bouncing in her seat. "Wait until you see your room. I helped make it special." Dr. Asher opened Clara's door and helped her out of the car. She stood for a moment, clutching her small bag containing her mother's diary, her eyes wide as she took in everything. The house seemed enormous to her after months of living on the streets. "Come on." Lily grabbed Clara's free hand, gently tugging her toward the front door. Grace unlocked it, and they all stepped inside. The entryway was warm and inviting, with family photos lining the walls. "Let's show Clara her room first," Dr. Asher suggested, noticing how overwhelmed she looked by all the new surroundings. They climbed the stairs together, Clara holding tight to both her bag and Lily's hand. When they reached the second door on the right, Lily stopped and bounced on her toes. "Close your eyes," she instructed excitedly. Clara hesitated, then slowly closed them, trusting her new sister. The door creaked open and Grace guided Clara inside. "Okay, you can look now." Clara opened her eyes and her mouth formed a small O of surprise. The room was painted in soft purple, her favorite color, something she'd mentioned to Lily during their hospital talks. Fairy lights twinkled along the ceiling, creating a gentle glow. On the bed sat several stuffed animals, arranged carefully with the one Lily had given her in the hospital placed in the center. But what caught Clara's attention most were the walls. They were covered in drawings, dozens of them, all made by Lily. Pictures of two girls playing together, of family picnics, of movie nights, and countless other happy scenes. "I drew all the things we're going to do together," Lily explained proudly. "Look, this one's us having ice cream, and this one's us playing in the park." Clara walked slowly around the room, touching everything gently, as if afraid it might disappear. When she reached the wooden bookshelf, Dr. Asher cleared his throat. "We have something else for you," he said, pulling out a leather-bound photo album. "I started this the day you came to the hospital." He sat on the edge of the bed and Clara climbed up beside him. As he opened the album, she saw photos of her first days in the hospital, then pictures of Lily reading to her, of their birthday celebration, and finally photos from the adoption ceremony. "There's plenty of room for more," Grace added softly, sitting on Clara's other side. "We'll fill it with all our new memories together." Clara ran her fingers over the photos, then reached into her bag and pulled out her mother's diary. With careful movements, she stood and walked to the bookshelf. She looked at the diary for a long moment, then placed it gently on the top shelf. Lily came to stand beside her, slipping her hand into Clara's. "Is that your mom's?" Clara nodded, squeezing Lily's hand. "She'd be happy I'm here," she whispered, her voice full of quiet certainty. The aroma of Grace's homemade lasagna filled the house as the family gathered around the dining table. Clara sat between Lily and Dr. Asher, her eyes wide at the sight of the steaming dish and freshly baked garlic bread. "This is my super special recipe," Grace explained, serving Clara a generous portion. "I only make it for the most important celebrations." Clara's chest warmed at the words. She watched as Dr. Asher filled everyone's glasses with sparkling apple cider, a fancy touch that made her feel grown up and special. "A toast," Dr. Asher announced, raising his glass. "To our newest family member, who has brought so much joy into our lives." "To Clara," Lily chirped, carefully lifting her glass without spilling. Clara ducked her head shyly, but a small smile played on her lips as she raised her own glass. The crystal made a delicate chiming sound as they clinked them together. As they ate, stories and laughter flowed freely around the table. Lily regaled them with tales from school, and Grace shared funny stories about Dr. Asher's cooking mishaps. Clara found herself giggling more and more, especially when Dr. Asher defended his infamous burnt pancake incident. "They weren't that bad," he protested with a grin. "They set off the smoke alarm." Grace laughed. "Can you teach me to cook?" Clara asked suddenly, surprising everyone, including herself, with her boldness. "Of course, sweetheart," Grace beamed. "We can start with something simple tomorrow if you'd like." After dinner, as Grace brought out a chocolate cake decorated with "Welcome Home Clara" in purple icing, Lily bounced excitedly in her chair. "Can we start our first family tradition tonight?" she asked. "Please, please, please." "What did you have in mind?" Dr. Asher asked, though his knowing smile suggested he already knew the answer. "Movie night," Lily declared. "Clara needs to experience our famous family movie nights, with popcorn and blankets and everything." Clara perked up at this suggestion. She'd never had a proper movie night before, and the way Lily described it made it sound magical. Soon, the living room was transformed. Grace and Lily gathered every soft blanket in the house while Dr. Asher made popcorn. Clara helped arrange pillows on the couch, carefully placing them just so. "You get to pick the movie," Lily told Clara, showing her their collection. "It's your special day." Clara selected an animated film about a lost baby elephant finding its way home. As the movie began, the family settled onto the couch together. Lily snuggled close to Clara's left side, while Dr. Asher sat on her right. Grace completed their cozy group, sitting next to Lily with the bowl of popcorn. As the story unfolded on screen, Clara felt herself relaxing deeper into the comfort of her new family. The warmth of their bodies next to hers, the soft blanket draped across their laps, and the gentle sound of their breathing made her feel safe and loved. Halfway through the movie, Clara found herself leaning against Dr. Asher's shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her gently, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she rested her head more comfortably against him, feeling truly at home for the first time since losing her mother. Time flowed like a gentle stream, carrying Clara and the Ashers through seasons of joy and growth. With each passing month, the scared little girl who had first entered the hospital transformed into a vibrant, confident child, whose smile could light up any room. The seasons painted their memories in vivid colors. During her first Christmas with the family, Clara's eyes sparkled as she helped Grace bake sugar cookies, flour dusting her nose as she carefully cut out star shapes. Lily taught her their family tradition of hanging ornaments, letting Clara place the angel on top of the tree while perched safely on Dr. Asher's shoulders. Spring brought Easter egg hunts in the backyard, Clara and Lily racing through dewy grass in matching sundresses. Summer welcomed beach trips where Clara, no longer frail and hesitant, built elaborate sandcastles with Lily while collecting seashells in her plastic bucket. Fall ushered in pumpkin patches and hayrides, Clara's laughter mixing with the crisp autumn air as she picked out the perfect pumpkin for carving. At school, Clara blossomed. Her report cards showed steady improvement, and soon her artwork began appearing on the refrigerator alongside Lily's. During her first school play, she delivered her lines perfectly as a brave little tree, beaming with pride as she spotted her family in the audience, all three of them cheering louder than anyone else. Dr. Asher watched these changes with a heart full of wonder. Standing in his study one afternoon, he found himself looking at the family photos that now covered his walls. There was Clara missing her front teeth in her second-grade photo, her eyes crinkling with joy. Another showed both girls covered in mud after a rainy day adventure, their guilty grins identical despite not sharing blood. His favorite was from Clara's first dance recital, where she stood in her tutu clutching a bouquet of roses, flanked by a proudly beaming Lily and Grace. The morning of Clara's 10th birthday dawned bright and clear. Dr. Asher sat on the porch swing with Grace, their fingers intertwined as they watched their daughters in the yard. Clara's dark hair, once matted and dull, now shone in the sunlight as she chased Lily through the sprinkler. Their squeals of delight filled the air, a sound that had become the heartbeat of their home. "Remember when she first came to us?" Grace asked softly, squeezing her husband's hand. Dr. Asher nodded, his throat tight with emotion. The scared little girl who had tugged on his coat in the hospital seemed like a distant memory compared to the confident child before them. Clara had not only survived but thrived, her resilient spirit touching everyone around her. "Look at them," he said, watching as Clara tagged Lily, both girls collapsing in a fit of giggles on the wet grass. "Sometimes I can hardly believe how far we've come." Grace rested her head on his shoulder, a content sigh escaping her lips. "She healed us as much as we healed her." The girls' laughter rang out again, pure and uninhibited. Clara's face glowed with happiness as she helped Lily up, both of them immediately launching into another game of chase. Their joy was infectious, a testament to the power of love and family to transform lives. If you enjoyed the story of Clara, Dr. Asher and his family, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.